They request a document trail pertaining to your import and export side. They ask a lot of questions about your business, about your inventory. So establishing your drawback program is not easy. That's where the legwork goes in. But the upside to it, it lasts for a lifetime. There would be no revoking of your privileges.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
All right, folks, it's still day 2, and we're going through ICPA here in Orlando, Florida. And so with today's program, we are going to get to talk to some folks from DHL. So
excellent.
And with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce yourself, if you don't mind.
Thank you, Andy. So this is Ed Hamilton. I'm with DHL Drawback Services, Vice President of Client Relations.
Excellent.
And I have with me.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alison McDonald, and I'm the operations lead at the Houston office.
Okay. All right. So, client relations.
Yes, client relations.
So, are you covering just like the ancillary type things from
we talked a lot about what my title should be. So basically, I've got over 35 years in industry. So I was on the other side of the desk.
There you go.
Picking drawback providers, figuring out how to use metrics, that kind of thing. And then when I was getting ready to hang it up, DHL approached me and said, hey, with all your experience, come work for us and help us out. So that's kind of my job. And we talked about what the title should be. And client relations really kind of spans operational effect as well as, trying to ensure that linkage between DHL brokerage and DHL drawback services is established. So I'm kind of that liaison between.
Well, and we're going to get into talking about drawbacks. So folks, in listening to this is going to be a little bit more of an advance past your basic type stuff. So, and on the drawback side, that's going to be more of your conventional brokerage type services, and then a niche within that. So, right?
Absolutely. And actually, one of the things that DHL did is they actually brought us in. We're a wholly owned company within DHL.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So the advantage of that is while DHL hasn't been doing drawback for more than, say, 15 years, which is a great time, we've actually been doing drawback for 30 years, and we are the drawback providers. So DHL bought us about 15 years ago, roughly. And so from that
What was your company called before then?
Well, originally we were Gulf Coast Drawback in 1988.
Okay.
And then from there we went into AEI Danzas, and then DHL bought Danzas. So that's how it all worked, and it's worked out very well. And so what we're finding out is because of the way it has evolved, honestly, 60% of our client base, it doesn't use drawback brokerage, it doesn't use DHL brokerage or DHL forwarding. So it really gives us a unique perspective. So we are not tied to DHL, rather we're servicing specifically drawback needs.
Well, and so there's the niche. So it's like, it's what you're saying is you don't have to be a DHL brokerage customer to utilize the drawback services.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. And sometimes people don't realize that.
Right. Well, with the big, the FedEx, the UPS, and the DHL, which is generally you're thinking of the express mode.
Right.
But there's also this huge, what I call conventional. My background's FedEx, obviously.
Okay.
For over 30 years. But they had to delineate between, this is express, and then you have conventional freight forwarding, conventional brokerage, those other types of things. So we get in there. Obviously, you're saying you're in the Houston area, so and from the operations side, so you get to be the one to roll up the sleeves, and with all these services, you actually make them reality, right?
I'm the boots on the ground, dealing with customs and our clients and everything in between.
Excellent. Wow. Excellent. Okay. So why don't we start off with what is a drawback? Since we're talking about this, and again, for our listeners here, and if you're on the virtual side of ICPA, hopefully you'll be attuned to some of this as well if you're interested in it. We'll wind up getting some of your contact information so we can post some of that.
Very
as well.
good. Very
All
good.
right, so what is a drawback?
Well, and actually, drawbacks the recovery of duties, taxes, and fees on imported items. But the key is the import tends to be what everybody goes after. It's the driver. I want my money back, which is good. I mean, it certainly helps the bottom line. But the reality is you have to have the second component. You have to have the enabler. So the imports have to be subsequently exported. So the import followed by the export, and then that can result on drawback, depending upon the rules.
So here, in general, I'm going to say it this way because I'm dumb as a box of rocks, so I got to keep it simple, right? Is if I were to import, let's say 10,000 widgets, I put them and I've brought them in, cleared them through customs or whatever, but I sell 2,000 of those widgets to somebody in Canada or somebody in France or whatever.
Okay.
So I'm exporting 2,000 widgets now over whatever period of time out of the country. That's the scenario you're saying that I can file for a drawback for that 2,000, or do I have to do all 10,000 or what?
Well, actually, that scenario you paint, 20% of the import duties that you paid could be qualified for drawback. And I have to be very careful how I phrase this because Allison is a fantastic resource and certainly an SME, and she's educated me quite a bit in this topic, and I'm still learning every day. So, as we all are.
Education.
But there are different rules associated with that, right? Because the one thing I love to talk about is, let's all go out and buy a $200,000 Mercedes, pay the duty for that, and then export maybe a Chevy Impala that's not quite that much, and recover all that duty on the $200,000 vehicle. Well, there's lesser of rules that come into play. So the value of the export has to be is basically looked at for the duty applied tariff, and then that ends up being the percentage. So in your scenario of the 10,000 widgets and the 2,000 widgets, depends on the value of the export, right? So it could come back to that. So drawback is very exciting area. I don't know of any other place in supply chain that you start looking at, getting money and giving it to the finance group, right? Finance group, you're always knocking on the door saying, okay, give me more money for all the haulage we got. We'll give you some profits. But here, you're saying, here's the money.
Right.
And it really becomes a money machine, right? You do the onboarding, you get the privilege applications, and then with an ongoing established supply chain, you establish truly a value-added machine or revenue stream back into the finance. And a lot of time the finance actually rely on that for their profits.
Attention all trade geeks. The G-Tech conference is coming to Oklahoma City and you won't want to miss it. Mark your calendars for July 30th through August 1st and join us for a jam-packed event with expert-less sessions and networking opportunities. And guess what? The Simply Trade podcast will be recording live at the event. Don't miss this unique chance to be featured on a show and share your insights with fellow trade professionals. We'll see you in Oklahoma City, where trade compliance takes center stage. Go to www.ncbfaa.org and become part of the action.
Right.
They're
Well,
really
and you're
adjustments.
talking about from a standpoint of your ratios of if you're financing the overall purchase of it, then you come back and you're doing your sales, but then I would assume that you're looking at it as part of that ROI. It's like, well, if we're going to export it,
Right.
where you're counting on X percentage to be a duty drawback scenario.
Right.
So you don't have to pass on that duty to your customer, right? You know
Right.
you're going to get it back.
Right. And I had a client asking about training here at Global Training Center for drawback because they had a partner who during the pandemic, everything shut down, imports, exports, and business, I guess, shut down. And the only way that 1 year that they stayed alive, that their partner, was through drawbacks, believe it or not.
Right.
That's what actually paid all the overhead for keeping the employees on board, even though there was no money coming in, which is crazy. I mean, that big of an impact it could have,
Correct. Correct.
And unlike, I guess I did want to ask something earlier. Unlike reconciliations where you get your money back, but that's very different from a drawback because reconciliations is a very different thing, but correct. So yeah,
reconciliation would be a case where you're making adjustments
for duties that you paid.
Well, all right. Let's look at it this way, and it's like, again, maybe you guys can help us in this, because I can guarantee you, it's like, even if I am on reconciliation as an importer, and some of the products that if I clear it under reconciliation, that's fine, but then I also can export those same goods and hopefully qualify for duty drawback at the same time, because reconciliation would be a case of, let's say that I bring in, let's say, again, 10,000 widgets. And as time goes on, there's some shortages in there, or maybe some overages or whatever. Reconciliation gives you the opportunity to make updates to that without penalty. It's like, because warehousing, right?
Right, exactly. So reconciliation, most of the time what we see is value. So if the value increases or decreases, once reconciliation's complete,
Right.
that'll be the new total. So with drawback, we actually can't file on any of your imports until your reconciliation is complete.
Correct.
Because we're taking that final value and the final duty that was paid.
And again, another thing about reconciliation is talking about the value is it could be based on exchange rates until you actually pay it or whatever, and it fluctuates. So if you have values that fluctuate, if you have quantities that fluctuate and all that, now what you cannot do is modify the HTS on the reconciliation. The commodity is what it is. You can't change it and say, well, we cleared it as widget A, but it really is widget B, and I'm just going to update it. No, it is what it is. But
Actually, there are post-summary corrections that
Yes,
can be
yes.
made if
Well,
you find
right.
a misclassification,
An error,
but you're
yeah,
right. That
yeah.
would not be what reconciliation's meant for.
And to your point, Allison just had a situation where somebody was the importer of record, and then they allowed the forwarder, unfortunately, to make the Schedule B assignment, which was not correct. I mean, it was totally not correct. And through Allison's coaching, they went back, they were able to adjust the Schedule B. Of course, there's a whole paper trail that has to be generated with that to ultimately allow for that drawback to file.
Okay.
all right, we're going to get into some of that, because you got to have, you just mentioned the audit trail. You've got to have, I know with drawback, some really good record retention and data flows that go through there. So it's like where you reference
Right.
the entry to the exports and all that. But all right, so as I'm looking at your outline that you've given us, I like
Just
this.
a guide,
This is
just
good.
a guide.
Yeah, just a guide. All right, so it says driver for drawback. What's the big deal here?
So I think one of the things is people really need to stay attuned to this, because it's such a dynamic area. So back in 2018, which sounds like a long time ago, but that's only 5 years ago.
Back in the day.
Yeah. I watch that pretty regularly as part of my job. And we had about $41 billion collected by customs when you look at duties, taxes, and fees.
So total.
Total, 21 or 41 billion. Of course, that's also when the 301s kicked in.
Right.
So just a few years later in 2022, we ended up seeing around 73 billion, right? And then last year ended up at $111 billion, duties, taxes, and fees. Now, the reason for this is in 2019 and third quarter, when this whole thing kicked in, there was exemptions allowed for the 301s, and it had a 3-year lifespan. So in 2021, I was actually tracking this, and I annualized the first 3 quarters, and it was going to come in at about 76 billion, but it ended up hitting 93. And the reason for that, exemptions expired.
Right.
And when people applied again, the exemptions were not granted. So 111 is where we're at right now at the end of 2022.
All right,
Almost
so
triple.
That is 111 of all the entries that are submitted.
Correct.
That's the duties
That's
and
year-end,
taxes. Yeah.
year-end
All right.
2022.
All right, so in a sense, in theory, that would be 111 billion that would go into the Treasury for the U.S. government.
And they like to keep that money.
Yes.
Of course.
To that point, Allison, can you make a little bit of comment about how the barriers of entry for drawback, the levels of criteria that customs has had, scrutiny, where that's gone?
Right. So to establish a drawback program, you have to apply with customs via a privilege application. And there are certain types of drawback, but overall, the same privileges exist for them. So that would be waivers of prior notice, one-time waiver, and your accelerated payment. So the customs process to approve this application is quite rigorous. They request a document trail pertaining to your import and export side. They ask a lot of questions about your business, about your inventory. So establishing your drawback program is not easy. That's where the legwork goes in. But the upside to it lasts for a lifetime. There would be no revoking of your privileges.
So in other words, I have to apply to say that I can be that I can apply or
Right.
file for a drawback, I guess is the word.
Yes, you have to, the company has, via us as drawback brokers, applies to establish a drawback program. And once it's granted, you can file claims.
Okay.
And one thing to keep in mind is it's a privilege. It's a privilege, not a right. It's kind of like your driver's license. Everybody kind of takes it for granted until you get a little bit sideways with the government and maybe you lose that privilege. That same thing can happen with customs. So it's important to have that documentation trail set up and you timely address customs concerns so that that privilege doesn't get revoked.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. All right. So you guys walk these clients through, say, okay, do you go in and say, does somebody come in to you and say, we definitely want drawback? Or is it a case of you go in and say, you know what, you have an opportunity and we could help show you, it's like, how do I know if I'm any good for a drawback program?
So we will do free analysis. Just all we need is a client's visibility on the import and export side. A lot of times clients do know or have an idea at least if they might have drawback. But we love to do a free analysis so you know exactly, we know exactly what, and you know exactly what's going to be on the table.
Well, you've got to assess, obviously, the facts of the situation. Even if I suspect that I would be good at, or suspect that I would be a good candidate for a drawback program.
Right.
But even with that, you would still have to assess it and say, yep, or no, you're full of beans. So,
well, generally what we say is there's a back of the envelope, right? So we do a detailed analysis, and it is important to do detailed analysis. But if somebody really doesn't know, the basic questions you can ask is, how much import duties am I paying? And then if you know your percentage export, don't worry about the country for now. I mean, there are regulations for that, but don't worry about it. So the percent of your sales that are export, multiply those numbers together. Import duty times percent of export sales. That gives you, now the actual drawback program will be less, absolutely. But it does tell you a little bit about the direction. But the detailed analysis is key. And, we do that. Actually, we kind of enjoy doing that because at the end of the day, we've seen some companies that have evolved to the point where their duty requirements become very less because what we do is then, of course, there's 7 different ways to try to avoid duty in the first place. And hopefully we can help them get to that point as well. But duty is a real thing that has to be addressed.
And part of the equation is also your client needs to have someone to feed you all that data though, right? I mean, because of the record keeping needs to be spot on and yes. So they need to even consider that. It's not like here you go, you do it, right?
And all clients have different levels of knowledge. Some come at this and they're very familiar with ACE. And when Allison and I ask for the ACE data, not a problem. Cross account access, it's routinely done, not a problem.
Right.
Others say,
they show up with an Excel spreadsheet.
Yeah, well, that or they just don't know what ACE data is.
Right.
Absolutely have no idea. And there are alternative ways of gathering that data. You can work with your forwarder or broker on your behalf to get that data.
Well, all right. So here's something that comes through is that if you are a company that's fairly new into dealing with international trade, so you're obviously either selling, importing, exporting, whatever, and you're not necessarily going to be a company that has enough staff to really maybe deal with some of this effectively. You should. Everybody says that, but it's like, okay, this is where it sounds like a service like what y'all are offering would come alongside one of these small companies, assess the scenario. Yeah, the bigger ones, again, there's some scenarios there, but I'm looking at that small mom and pop shop or the small companies that are growing, maybe even $1 million in revenue. Now they're going even more and whatever. Guess what? They're still looking at every dime, but in this, they're leaving money on the table if they don't look at this. This is a scenario here where, you know what, you can improve your margins just by looking at it and going, you know, what qualifies, all right? So what does qualify for a drawback?
Well, there is a point of diminishing returns. So if you have a drawback situation where I'll be honest, if it's less than $20,000, unfortunately, it's going to just be the cost of doing business, because the thing you open yourself up for is there's a lot of documentation associated with this that some companies just aren't prepared to go after. And the effort involved, the potential audits that you have, the potential reputation that you might lose. I mean, there definitely is a point of diminishing returns. So a small mom and pop shop, honestly, I think our general rule is if it's less than 20,000, we're probably not going to be able to help.
And that's fine.
And by the way, that's a note that when I talk to some people, some of our peers say, well, I'm surprised it's not 150,000.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, but again, it's all that scenario where as you're going through and looking at it, it exposes folks to, you know, here's the game. I mean, it's a scenario where, all right, should I establish a FTZ, for example, as one of the, to avoid paying duties that I don't need to?
Right.
Well, FTZ is one of the tools, possibly an in-bond warehouse or a bonded warehouse, excuse me. The cost of establishing a bonded facility, warehouse, or a foreign trade zone, and all of that, you got to weigh that to, is it just cheaper just to do a duty drawback claim?
Right.
You know,
right.
So as you look at that scenario, again, it's just.
So to give an example, we had a client that approached us, had $30,000 in import duties, and they were actually exporting that material. And, you know, we talked to them pretty extensively, and at the end of the day, we were going to walk away from the opportunity. But then at the end of the day, we said, wait a minute. Perhaps we talked the client up and we said, let's do a shared opportunity here. We're going to give you 20 of that 30 back, and we're going to take 10 to do the processing and everything else. And they were ecstatic. They said, you know, we can't find anyone to help us out in this case. So that's a scenario where, again, a partnership comes along. Certainly a FTZ would not be the answer for them. But yeah, it's definitely economic. You all have to do the economics to determine which is the right answer. And a lot of times it's a combination. There is no one right answer.
Well, each one, that's why it's important for people that are in this, look out or reach out to an expert so that you can get in. What's it going to hurt? I mean, you do the analysis like you just said, you're willing to offer it. There's probably a good portion of them that you look at and go, you know what? It's not worth your time and money. Keep doing what you're doing, but there it is. On the flip side of it, if I'm the importer and I'm exporting something, okay, so no, doesn't hurt anybody. So.
And we already talked a little bit about this earlier, about the data that needs to be provided, right? But what other challenges do you see in entering this program?
So it is data visibility, but secondary to that is Customs still, upon audit of claims, looks for physical documentation. Your import entry summaries, your proof of export. I mean, they actually want the copies, and they're on the export side only certain documents that are considered proof of export, like an ocean bill of lading, for instance. So I do think that is most of the time the challenge with new clients facing record retention and trying to get older documentation from their forwarder and realizing that there's no archive and just having a lot of challenges with that barrier.
Well, the record retention also is one that there's got to be some cross-referencing. So that would help things versus a manual cross-reference. So in other words, an entry comes in, you've got it tied to a purchase order. All right, so that kind of scenario. Okay, great. Well, then if you've got a PO that has, let's say, 50 entries over a course of a year that come in, hopefully your record retention scenario there would tie that entry to that specific purchase order. Would be an ideal
That's
situation.
ideal. I was about to say, so this is the best case scenario.
Yeah, best case scenario, and then you go from there. Because when we're talking through this, it's almost like a reverse engineer. It's like, here's an ideal situation. And then a lot of folks, I can't do that. Okay, there are ways to compensate that, but it's going to take more labor, and guess what? Your cost goes up. But you know what? In the long run, you can then make the recommendations. All right, from here on out, when it comes in, here's your reference on the bill of lading. Here's your reference on the entry. Here's your reference on the commercial invoice. That needs to be all tied in, right?
And that's exactly what happens for clients that don't already have the systems in place like that, the cross-referencing, they establish it. So forward occurring shipments do have that.
Right.
It's the backlog because Drawback, you can go 5 years back in activity.
Right.
So.
And go ahead.
Well, I think it's also important to recognize as people get into the level of detail that we're talking about, the whole overall process gets much better. And the other thing is, a lot of folks don't have quarterly business reviews for their broker. And these are the kind of details when they start finding this out, if they start having those type of requirements and feedback back to the broker's then held accountable for the quality of job that they're providing.
Right.
I mean, we have seen several times in ACE where the entry line item, the entry with the line numbers, they're being used for multiple tariffs when they shouldn't be. Now, I know for 99 and 98, that's fine, but I'm talking about commodity tariffs. And that really is a detriment to the client in trying to fix all that when they could have possibly used a substitution type drawback and it all falls apart.
And what I was going to say also, my background is in technology. So I used to develop software for global trade. So we had a situation where clients, this is 15, whatever, so a bunch of years ago, that were asking us, well, now that you do, entries and all this, can you do a drawback software? So we started exploring that, right? More often than not, they are like, we're not going to do this. Let's just hire someone.
It's too complex.
So why would you do that instead of do self-filing? I mean, to me, it was obvious because they would come to us and then leave. But I mean, I'm not in the business to,
That's just one of the many reasons because we have proprietary software. DHL Drawback Service is actually building a Drawback Max even. So that's one of the reasons why going with a broker as opposed to self-filing is a better option.
Yeah.
Well, I think also the expertise as well, I know Allison deals with customs practically on a daily basis. So establishing that credibility, that reputation. I mean, customs does not have the time to audit 100% absolute detail for everybody. So at some point, reputation comes on the line. And you want to talk a little bit about the CEEs and what that has done?
Right. So centers of excellence, it's customs drawback locations. I believe there are 5 of them. And there's certain industries where you send your claims. Because of the volume of claims that we file, I know every supervisor, I know most of the specialists, and that is a benefit. So my request, my email, I know that it would be seen and acknowledged, and not that a self-filer wouldn't, but it's not going to have the same gravity.
Well, here, let me look at it this way, though. A company or a person could do their own filing. The question is that a wise move versus hiring a broker? And you're just giving it where you've got that expertise and all that. I always kind of relate this to even your income tax, okay?
Right.
yes, I could file my own and prepare my own 1040 and file my own U.S. Tax return. But I have learned that it is by far better to go with an accountant, and they can go through it because they're up to speed. They know this stuff and they can knock that stuff out. Whereas I'm going through it and I could read all the information, walk it through. I could even find software that helps me. But I'm still not 100% confident that I'm like, am I doing this right or what? Or I may be
you're gonna
claiming
miss,
something.
you're gonna miss a deduction or not, or whatever, a benefit somewhere.
And I have found from a personal standpoint on the tax side, and I use that as a relation because a lot of people try to figure out, well, this is foreign to me. Well, let me pick something that you can relate to, right?
Right.
So I have found that without exception, every time I've done my own taxes and then I turn around and give it to somebody, an accountant, and they have always been able to get more money back on a refund, or I've had to pay less taxes when they've calculated, and it's all legit, and I'm going, hey, this is good. That's enough for me. I'm not going to quit. I'm going to quit doing it on my own. In this case, you know by looking at it because you're doing it all the time. You have that expertise, as you were just saying. So yeah, it would make sense to a wise move to hire somebody to do your drawback.
Well, directly to your point, we actually deal with 41 different industries. If you look at like the Security and Exchange Commission's classification of companies, we dug that out and classified our clients, and we do 41 different industries. Now, the first time you hear that, you go, well, we want someone specialized. Well, actually, that is specialized in drawback because as you're filing your taxes, if you use that example, you want somebody that has seen a lot of different scenarios.
Right.
And when you start talking about aerospace, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, obviously there's other areas we get into, you start recognizing that the activity can be applied across the grid because it's the rules, not the industry, that's important.
Excellent. Okay, so if I want to do a drawback, what is it that I should do? What would be an ideal scenario here that if a future client comes to you or something and says, we want to do a drawback, what should I do?
Well, I think the first thing that we obviously do is we have a survey that we sent them because it helps us to be able to talk their language, understand their supply chain. Are they handing it off to somebody else? Are they giving it, are they importing? Are they getting something that somebody else has imported? Are they giving it to a distributor who then exports it? Those type of things are important because really there's three different models when you start, three different types of partners when you get into a drawback scenario. Internals were in the EIN, the electronic, EIN, I just dropped it. The EIN number is
ECCN or?
No. The
employer identification
employer
number.
Identification number.
Okay, yeah.
We use so many acronyms that just we used to do it. And
EIN, you were right.
Yeah. So anyways, if that's the importer of record as well as the exporter of record, it's pretty straightforward. But it could be a shared scenario where, if you're not the exporter, you need to get the export rights assigned to you because the exporter has the first right by law to file for drawback. But the exporter can't file for drawback if they didn't do the import. So maybe they need some other assignments the other way. Okay. And then the last, probably the most complicated one is trading. Trading was when there is an importer of record who's a net importer, an exporter who's a net exporter. Let's back it up a minute. Let's just say that there's a conglomerate that is European based.
Okay.
And they import into the U.S. and sell into the import market. Likewise, there's a conglomerate in the U.S. that's selling the same type product but exporting it to Europe. Well, the export and the import exist, but they aren't the same companies. A third-party broker comes in, a trader and a brokerage trader, and what they do is establish a relationship with the importer, establish a relationship with the exporter. They file, and then that money is then split three ways, usually evenly. That's a very complicated way of doing it, and it also results in the money being able to be recovered.
Right. All right. So in other words, that's a scenario where it's almost like a substitution there of one person's import, another person's export, and you're pulling it together.
The key is commercial relationship. There has to be a commercial relationship established. Okay. And also in that scenario, typically the importer does not know who the exporter is. There's a shielding there.
Right.
And a lot of that's also maybe they don't want to share the pricing information. Maybe they are competitors.
Right. All right, so we're getting into some really complex stuff here.
But sorry, that,
All right, no. Actually,
We
but what
drifted.
I'm getting is my point is folks, if you are listening to this, you have an idea of the drawback, but it's like, listen, my elevator doesn't make it all the way to the top, so I have to look at it and go, all right, you may have to go through that again. That's fine, because this is really complex, but there's money on the table.
money on the table,
Yes, sir.
$111 billion.
Yeah, and you want a piece of that. It's like you want to be able to, if you paid it out, you want to be able to get it back. So it is by far a smart move to get an expert. Ask the question. It didn't hurt anything, right?
Yes, it is. Smart move.
So some of the things that we do, and you would look for, back to your point, what do you look for when you're going to pick a broker? There are certain things you want to look for. So for instance, we do not do a fee-based service. Ours is strictly commission. So
Oh, so in other words, you get
get
paid
money,
off of
yeah.
results.
we get paid off of results. If we get into it and we find, for instance, maybe the record retention wasn't what the company had expected, well, they're disappointed, we're disappointed, but at no point do we start saying, well, I'm sorry, we put the effort in, you got to pay us.
You got to give us some money. Yeah.
So that's important because that gets everybody in the same boat, rowing in the same direction, right?
So the scenario is that, for lack of better terms, I'll say it this way: you're actually putting skin in the game, as we would say.
Yes.
So in other words, if your client is successful, you will be.
Correct. And the other thing we do is, as Allison mentioned, complementary analysis. And we truly is complementary. We give it to you, and if you choose to take it to a competitor, that's fine. It's not a problem. But it just helps people understand where they stand as a starting point.
Right.
We talked about the survey, and then it gets into, like I said, the data. So it's a progression as we start ratcheting up to the point of, do we really want to go for a drawback program?
With that said, if somebody's interested, they could probably just go to the DHL.com and then put in duty drawback or drawback for that matter, on a generic search on your website, and they're going to get down to your stuff, right?
Yep, Drawback Services.
Drawback
Services. DHL Drawback Services is our website.
Okay.
And again, there's a lot of other good drawback companies out there, right?
Right.
But you just want to make sure that you're dealing with them.
All right, I want to ask you one other question here. Let me shift gears for the conference that we're at. What do you think about ICPA in this conference here this year?
I think it's great.
Have y'all been?
I think the engagement of people is really good. I mean, I was in San Diego last year,
Okay.
and it was good. And of course, obviously, we were on the tail end of COVID and things of that nature. So people are back, and people are back with a passion, right? We've had a lot of people come in and just say, hey, I'm thinking about a drawback program, and talk to me. And when you come to these kind of shows, it really allows you to jump from booth to booth and talk to people. Because I'll tell you what, the drawback rules are the drawback rules. There's nothing unique about it. But what it comes to is execution. You want to make sure, like, for instance, what we did is we actually broke down our work process, and we used a Rumbler Bresh technology where we actually mapped out our process, ensured we had good handoffs in the steps, and then ultimately allowed us to make sure there wasn't a gap where something falls through the cracks.
Right.
Challenge the brokerage and say, hey guys, tell me about your process, tell me about your history, and most importantly, give me a reference. And if the reference is somebody who's credible, and talk to that reference and ask them about their scenario, then you're definitely headed in the right direction.
Have you had some of your clients come by and go, hey, we use your services and stop by and say hello to you, or what?
Definitely.
Yeah?
And that's my favorite part. Some clients I've been talking to for years, actually, and so meeting them face to face is always nice.
Nice.
So I enjoy that.
That's always a good thing. Getting face to face, and the virtual stuff, I think everybody's just fed up with it, to be honest.
Yeah.
But it's like you got to do some of it, and I think conference calls have now been completely changed to video conferencing, and even then, it's been interesting. So,
And it looks like we're about to go to lunch, so let's try to wrap it up. Or where do we get started?
Well, basically, you can reach out to us.
Our website.
Yes, thank you. I don't know. So DHL Drawback Services
Right.
is our website. You can reach out to us that way. We have info at DHL Drawback or info at drawbackservices.com. I think that's right. And then and at the end of the day, I don't know, help me out, Allison. Oh yeah, Ed Hamilton on LinkedIn.
Yeah,
So
and then what we're gonna put, we have what are called show notes for the podcast, which is kind of like a little mini description of what we're doing, and it's searchable. So
Right.
we'll put your contact information, your LinkedIn information, your website. So don't worry. So it'll be in there.
All right. Well, listen, thank you for stopping by. And again, we are about to break for, as we are on day 2 of ICPA. And this has been a great conversation.
It was.
And I think we're going to be ready for, bigger and greater things go on here. So,
Well, Lalo and Andy, thank you guys
Sure.
very much. Appreciate the time, and obviously we really appreciate talking about Drawback. It's passionate
course,
for
yes.
us.
wow.
Great. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.